All righty. Okay, so our next student presentation is Paul Tietz. Paul is a Master Science student here in the Soil and Land Resources program. He completed his degree in environmental sciences from the University of Wisconsin in River Falls. So Paul, I'll let you introduce your topic.
Okay, thank you, Dan. My name is Paul Tietz. I'm a first-year master's student in soil and land resources. I am presenting today about my thesis topic, which is the use of hyperspectral sensing to detect forest soil, phosphorus, and wildfire ash metal content. There is quite a bit going on in that title, but the key part is hyperspectral sensing. That means I'm dealing with remote sensing, a field in which there are lots of applications to environmental science. So a key fundamental in any environmental monitoring study that you may do is fieldwork, going into the field to collect your physical samples of soil or water, or maybe like plant tissue or something. You collect those samples, bring them back to the lab, and analyze them for whatever you're trying to learn about, maybe plant water content or nitrogen levels or soil texture or something. Remote sensing asks the question, what if you could collect that same data without having to collect the samples? What if you could measure those same properties from a satellite image or from an airplane flyover or maybe a drone? If you could do that, you could massively increase the spatial scale of your study. You could also include more areas that are inaccessible to fieldwork, maybe difficult to reach on foot, and you could just collect data much more efficiently, way more observations in way less time. Clearly, there's a lot to like about remote sensing in the field of environmental science, but it's not always easy to go from images to environmental data. The data in remote sensing is totally based on the electromagnetic spectrum. So just as human eyes perceive color based on the wavelengths that are reflected from any given object, remote sensing systems work in much the same way. You can think of a regular digital camera as a remote sensing system. So when taking a picture, a camera records 3 values for each pixel in the image. These 3 values represent the wavelength reflectance in the red region, the green and blue regions of the electromagnetic spectrum. So these cover the visible spectrum from about 380 to 750 nanometers, because that's what humans can see. So they take an average of the red wavelengths, green and blue, to create those 3 values and 3 layers essentially per pixel in an image. We would call a camera like that a multispectral sensor because it records 3 spectral bands. A remote sensing system that might be a bit fancier can see more wavelengths than just the visible light. And it also collects more spectral bands than just the 3 that a digital camera would. So maybe instead of aggregating a couple hundred bands together to make the green light, they collect a separate value for every 3 to 10 nanometers, all the way from maybe 350 to 2500, which is here in the infrared region. So a system like that would be called a hyperspectral system because of all of the data layers collected. This at the right is an example of a spectral reflectance curve collected by a hyperspectral system. The y-axis shows reflectance factor out of 1, so maybe 100% reflectance. Something that's lightly colored, like snow, will reflect a lot of light and have reflectance around 80%, versus things that are darker or maybe absorb more light than they reflect, like water, are down there around 10%. So if you look closely at the x-axis of this graph, you'll see wavelength, and the visible wavelengths are just a tiny portion of all of the wavelengths observed by the system. So not only can it see way more wavelengths in general than a human can, it can also see a lot more variation than humans can pick up on. So when I was first learning about remote sensing systems, I was pretty skeptical. Like, can they really measure environmental data this accurately from just a picture? It doesn't seem like that should be possible. But really there's a lot more data in these images than humans can really perceive. You can just see how much variation there is within these infrared, invisible wavelengths compared to what human eyes can see. So here is what I will be using the device to measure my my spectra. It is created by Analytical Spectral Devices in Boulder, Colorado. We can just call it the ASD for short too. A little bit about how it works is it takes in light through this probe tip here. It's not a lens, so it's not really a camera that can take pictures. It's just a little opening that lets in light. The light that enters the probe travels through fiber optic cables within this steel cable here into the instrument where the wavelengths are read, and a readout on the connected laptop shows the spectral reflectance graph and all of the wavelength data. So this little handle here is the palm grip that just makes carrying the probe and aiming it a little easier. You can pack up this whole system into a backpack and carry it into the field. And every time you click the spacebar, the probe will record the reflectance data from 350 to 2500 nanometers of whatever object you're aiming at. So this brings me to what I'm actually going to be doing with it. My first of two objectives is to use the hyperspectrometer to measure the amount and the leaching potential of soil phosphorus in forest systems, one forest system in particular being Lake Tahoe. Unfortunately for me, I won't get to do any field work at Lake Tahoe for now. Those soil samples have already been collected by a past grad student by the name of Tom Heron. Tom collected those soil samples for his research project. The samples came from varying parent materials within the Lake Tahoe basin, including granite bedrock and volcanic bedrock, like basalt rock maybe, and different landscape positions, so forest and maybe the uplands and more lowland meadows. He was interested in the amount of phosphorus and also the variation of it, like the fractionation, how phosphorus occurs in the Lake Tahoe environment. There are labile forms and non-labile forms that behave differently. So although I don't get to do any of Tom's field work, I also don't have to do any of his lab work. He did plenty of extractions and analyses that I'm not very jealous of so far, at least. He did lots of extractions to determine like the water-soluble phosphorus, Bray1P extractable phosphorus, and microbial phosphorus that had been taken up by microbes, representing more labile forms. And his non-labile forms of phosphorus that he was measuring included the total phosphorus, which itself is the combination of organic versus an inorganic fraction, a Malic 3 extractable phosphorus, and oxalate extractions. So he has collected a lot of data. His findings were that the granite parent materials had low overall levels of phosphorus, and also the more labile forms. So granite was less likely to retain phosphorus, probably more likely to release it into either groundwater or surface water like the lake itself. The volcanic parent materials, on the other hand, had higher total phosphorus levels, but more non-labile forms. So they're more tightly adsorbed to the aluminum and the iron oxides within the Andic soils in Lake Tahoe. So what I'm planning to do now is try to replicate his findings without doing all the lab work, using the hyperspectrometer as maybe a shortcut. So I will collect reflectance data for all of his pre-analyzed samples. And since I'll be doing this in the lab, I'll use this lighted probe with a special light bulb that emits light in all the wavelengths analyzed from 350 to 2500 nanometers. And I can take a reading of this probe over this spectralon material here. It's an ultra white surface that is assumed to reflect 100% of light. So you can see just in comparison to that white sheet of paper on a white table surface, just how brilliant and ultra reflective the spectralon is. So I'll read a reflectance over the spectralon, assume that to be 100%, and then take more readings over each soil sample. And because of just the colors absorbed by the soil and reflected out in the visible range, there's also going to be those similar interactions in the infrared regions, maybe between carbon and hydrogen bonds in the soil, or bonds between phosphorus and oxygen atoms, or the organic matter in general. It's everything in the soil is going to interact differently with the light and give the curve, the reflectance curve, its shape. So I just was in the lab last week collecting my very first preliminary data, which unfortunately I don't like very much because I have reflectance measured at 1 here, 1.0 maximum reflectance, and the data is exceeding that. So it does not make much sense at all that the soil samples are reflecting more light than the spectral on. So I probably have some calibration error or settings to work out, because I was expecting results that look a little bit more like this. These are a series of soil reflectance curves from another study. Things I like about their reflectance curves are more variation within the infrared regions here. They're just smoother, I guess more consistent, especially towards the fringes, and reflectance never really exceeds 30 or 40%. So I plan to emulate the methods and the process of this study and others like it. Probably a good way to start would be getting a tripod for the probe, so I know I'm holding it at the same light for all the sample, at the same level for all the samples. And another, just the process of this study and others like it include taking some of their samples. So out of 74 total samples, this study took 59 of them to build their statistical model. So there's many ways to do this, many programs, but in essence, you want to predict the soil phosphorus concentration, if that's what you're interested in, based on the wavelength data. So you'll have to, while you're building the model, you still have to do the lab analysis to get the observed concentrations, and you train a model based on that. So you will take some observed phosphorus level at the average wavelength for the average value for each wavelength, and then add the wavelength of interest times the effect of that wavelength plus some error term. So in a simplified version, that's the equation that these studies are producing. Once you have that equation, you test it by introducing the samples you held out from the model. So you use that as a test set to see how well you can actually predict the phosphorus concentrations compared to the measured value from your lab analysis. So this study had pretty darn good results. These seem to fall right on the line for their total phosphorus, especially compared to maybe the potassium that this group also looked at. But yeah, this is total phosphorus. Other studies have attempted to get more specific than just total phosphorus, maybe looking at organic versus inorganic fractions, or the Malic 3 extractable, or labile versus non-labile, just to learn more about what is actually in the soil samples. There's really no limits on what you can attempt to measure based on the data you have. So the more data you have to go on, the better you can train your model. So since Tom did plenty of extractions and created lots of data for me, I will ride this down as far as I can go to see if I can identify from the wavelength data the total phosphorus levels, but also the forms present, the phosphorus species, and which ones are more likely to be mobile in the environment. So there's no guarantee that the R-squared value is going to stay at 0.98. That's pretty good, but results may vary. So if that's successful, if this method of building a model to predict environmental data from wavelength information works, I would switch gears into my second objective, which is to measure heavy metals and elements of concern in post-wildfire ash and soil with the hyperspectrometer. So to start with wildfires, it's no secret that they have an extensive environmental impact, especially in the short term. When vegetation is burned, there's lots of ash created and bare soil exposed to either wind and water, which is easily eroded. So especially the first time there's rainfall after a wildfire, there's lots of ash loading into surface water. However, there's generally a low contamination risk to these aquatic systems from that ash runoff, because wildfires are a very natural process in forest systems that regenerate forest ecosystems. Wildfires have been happening on Earth probably as long as there have been forests on Earth. So on their own, there's not much of a contamination risk from wildfire ash. However, it gets a little bit more complicated when humans enter the equation, particularly with climate change. So also, it's not that much of a secret that climate change is expected to increase wildfire frequency, intensity, and the area impacted in a given year. I think the last year's 2020 fire season is a pretty strong example of that. Intense fire season maybe increased a bit by the effects of climate change. Another thing we have to contend with is historical forest contamination and fire suppression, especially in an area like this, west of the Cascades, with large urban areas. For many decades in the past, there have been lots of industry and just automobile traffic that create air pollution. With air pollution comes atmospheric deposition of those pollutants into surrounding forests. At the same time, there's been fire suppression. So as the urban wildland interface has increased, as we've been developing, building homes and roads and infrastructure in forest lands, we've been suppressing or preventing fires from occurring that maybe they would have naturally been occurring. So what this does is increase fuel loads and just makes wildfires even worse when they do happen and eventually get out of control. So with these things in mind, maybe there is a risk of contamination from ash loading and surface water now in certain areas. There's particularly concerns about nutrients in ash that could maybe increase algal growth in surface water, but also metals from the legacy contamination. So maybe there's not as much lead being emitted from cities since the Clean Air Act and recent sustainability measures, but these are still the legacy pollutants that could be still out there. So when a wildfire happens, especially in an area like this, the post-fire response becomes pretty important. It's really important to determine if there is a risk of contamination from this wildfire ash. However, that's pretty hard to do. One reason being the vast areas burned by these wildfires. So they can be up to thousands and thousands of acres, and that's just difficult to sample when you have so much area to measure. It can also be difficult to access these areas in remote or mountainous forests, or if access is otherwise cut off and they can't be reached in a timely manner. And reaching in a timely manner itself is really important, because as soon as wind picks up or there's a rainfall event, the ash is not going to wait for us to sample it. It's going to be on the move. So this really makes wildfire response a perfect use for remote sensing. And before we can do that, we need to collect lots of data. So where I come in with the hyperspectrometer is taking readings of the ash spectral reflectance and attempting to model contaminant concentrations. So is it possible to observe the lead or the iron concentrations in wildfire burned ash? So that would require taking either archived samples of ash or collecting fresh ones and reading the reflectance, and also doing the lab analysis of a traditional determination of the concentration of potential contaminants. And then through that, creating either a model or identifying the specific wavelengths of light that correspond to contaminant presence and whatnot. And if that's successful, potentially scaling it up into satellite imagery, if we can identify the bands that are of interest and get those on satellites or read them from existing satellites, or adapt drones or maybe airplane systems to collect this remote data and know in a very timely manner what contamination risk there may be from a wildfire. So that is what I hope to do in my thesis research. If you have any questions about remote sensing systems, the electromagnetic spectrum, or the soil phosphorus or wildfire ash risks, I'd be happy to try to answer your questions, but thank you.
Hi, Paul. I have a question.
Sure, Maggie.
How do you know that, I guess, that you're looking at soil phosphorus, so that your absorbance readings, or maybe not absorbance, whatever it's reading, is the phosphorus in the system? And is there any like contamination or what else interferes with that in the soil?
That's a very good question from our phosphorus expert. Yeah, really, how do you know that this wavelength is reflecting off of a phosphorus atom individually? Or is it a direct relation, or is it maybe a correlation? So if there's a lot of organic matter in the soil, which is easy to observe remotely, maybe that's just tied to higher phosphorus concentrations. So it's important to think about that in studies. There's definitely a strong match between phosphorus and organic concentrations. But yeah, it varies between wavelength and species that you're looking at, I guess. But also just having the data. So if you can really increase your training set, you can account for variation between samples that have lots of organic matter, but maybe lower phosphorus, and use the lab extractions to try to address that. So it's not necessarily direct all the time, but with enough data to go on, you can probably make a connection.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Hey, Paul, I have a question.
Sure.
First, this is a really cool study, so I'm excited to see what you come up with. Too bad you cannot go to Tahoe. That's a bummer. But I was curious, can the same work be done with drones? And if so, would you plan to do that as well?
Absolutely, it can. There's a trade-off with a handheld sensor versus a sensor mounted on a drone. So with a handheld sensor, you have a really great spatial resolution. I can take a spectral reflectance observation of like a really small area, maybe something that I'm certain that this is the soil sample that I'm reading, and this is the reflectance from this soil sample. I have that great certainty with my handheld sensor. If I were to fly a drone over soil in place in Lake Tahoe, I'm not always certain that I'm flying over the soil that I want to analyze. There could be plants in the way, or like pavement, roads, or like vegetation. So there's definitely trade-offs with spatial and spectral resolution that go into it. I would be very interested to fly a drone, and if that fits in with my project, I would be very happy to do that because drones are cool. But yeah,
Right. Thanks.
Potential exists.
Right. Well, thank you. And maybe there'll be room for you to go to Tahoe just once.
Right.
Thanks, Mariana. And I just want to mention, Mariana was actually the PI on the project for the Tahoe study that Tom.
Right, of course.
So she's pretty familiar with that data.
Yep.
Okay, any other questions? Alrighty. Well, great. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Paul. We had very interesting presentations today. And our last set of presentations for the semester, I think it's the last ones, are next week. So I'll be sending announcements out to everyone. Thank you all for participating today, and I will be seeing you next week.